Let's now have a look at another pivotal moment in U.S.-Latin American relations, and here we're going to discuss the Spanish-American War of 1898. This conflict, by the way, has also been called the Spanish-Cuban-American War. That's how it's known in Cuba, in fact, because the war was fought in Cuba, and it involved Cuban independence. And so if you remember, Cuba and Puerto Rico did not gain independence from Spain in the 1820s. Instead, they remained the last Spanish colonies in the Americas. And Cuba fought two wars of independence. The first conflict, known as the 10 Years' War, lasted from 1868 to 1878, and it resulted in a stalemate between the two sides. Then, the Cubans rose in revolt again in 1895, so this is known as Cuba's Second War of Independence. And after 1895, the Cuban rebels, who you see pictured here, they had a lot of success against the Spaniards, and they were poised to defeat the Spaniards. And there were two guerrilla movements that were throughout the island that were really wearing on the Spanish army. And the rebels controlled much of the countryside. They destroyed the sugar economy by setting fires to the cane fields, and it was also a very brutal war. The Spaniards forced rural Cubans into concentration camps in order to deprive the rebels of its base of support in the countryside. And these concentration camps were notorious for their deplorable conditions, and tens of thousands of Cubans died of starvation in these concentration camps set up by the Spaniards. In the meantime, in the United States, there was a lively debate in U.S. politics and in newspapers on whether to support the Cuban rebels or not. Some Americans wanted to end the fighting for humanitarian reasons, and the American public was generally on the side of the insurgents. But many powerful people actually did not support Cuban independence in the United States. So many politicians feared that Cubans were incapable of self-government, and they feared that Haiti would become another black republic. They were motivated by racism, in other words. And some wealthy Americans also opposed U.S. intervention because they had investments in Cuba and the Cuban sugar economy. And the rebels were calling for the sugar estates to be divided among the poor rural masses. And so these desires of the Cuban rebels to carve up the sugar estates, this threatened American property owners in the Spanish colony. And all the meanwhile, President McKinley, he was accused in the press of sitting idly by and not doing anything to stop the Spanish atrocities that were occurring in the concentration camps. That all changed with the explosion of the USS Maine in February of 1898. This was at a moment where the Cuban rebels were poised for victory. But there was the USS Maine, as you see pictured here on the outline in the slide. The USS Maine had been sitting in Havana Harbor, and it was there ostensibly to protect U.S. investments. And it explodes in February of 1898, and it killed 250 U.S. servicemen. And immediately, American politicians and newspapers blamed the Spaniards for placing a mine in the harbor to blow up the Maine, and they began calling for war against Spain. And years later, the Maine was dug up, and it was investigated over the causes of the explosion. And it was later concluded that the Maine exploded because of an internal explosion. There was 5 tons of gunpowder that discharged from the vessel's 10-inch guns. And so it was an internal explosion. It was an accident. This had occurred on a few other ships that were similar to the Maine. But nonetheless, at the moment in February 1898, it was blamed on the Spaniards, and there was a rush to war. And all of a sudden, the American public was calling for the U.S. to intervene in Cuba's war for independence. And by May, the United States sent its army and its navy to defeat the Spaniards. And it was a very quick war. I think Theodore Roosevelt called it a, quote, splendid little war. And by July, the Spanish army, who had already been worn down by the Cuban rebels, the Spanish army was defeated by the summer. And this is how Cuba gains its independence, let's say. I'm hesitant to say that Cuba gains its independence in 1898 with the expulsion of Spain, because, as we'll see here, the Platt Amendment that was incorporated into the Cuban Constitution severely limits Cuba's sovereignty. And from 1898 to 1902, the U.S. Army occupied Cuba. So it was a 4-year occupation of the island. And you see, American leaders still believed that Cuba was not ready for self-government. And the U.S. would occupy the island and teach the Cubans on how to govern themselves, right? A very paternalistic view of Cuba and Latin Americans in general at this time. And the U.S. Army demobilized the Cuban rebels quite easily by paying 33,000 of them $75 for their weapons. But no property was ever redistributed to the landless poor. And Cuba was also subject to segregation practices that were prevalent, of course, in the American South, and they were exported to Cuba during these years as the American Army occupied the island. And so in sum, we could say the United States intervened in Cuba's War of Independence to liberate the island from Spanish rule, but not to liberate the island from the United States. That's what I mean by Cuba's independence was very limited at this time. And this becomes very clear when we look at the Cuban Constitution of 1902 and the Platt Amendment, which was incorporated into the document. And the 1902 Constitution was very much like the U.S. Constitution, but the Platt Amendment is what really separates it from the American document. And there was a great debate in the United States about what exactly to do with Cuba, whether to incorporate it as a state into the American Union or to rule it by proxy. And Senator Thomas Platt, who headed the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate, he came up with an amendment to the Cuban Constitution that removed absolute sovereignty from the Cuban government, and it preserved U.S. dominance over the island. So I want to go over a few of the tenets of the Platt Amendment here. Very important piece of legislation in Cuban history especially, but also in Latin American history. The Platt Amendment, it stated that Cuba could not make a foreign treaty and could not take out foreign loans without U.S. approval. So basically, Cuban foreign relations were dominated by the U.S. It also said that the U.S. had the right to intervene in Cuba in order to preserve stability. And this actually has the opposite effect, because people are going to resent the Platt Amendment in Cuba, and it's going to lead to actually political instability in the region and on the island. And in fact, the U.S. Army is going to occupy Cuba again from 1906 to 1909. And finally, Cuba pledged to lease land to the United States for naval bases, and this is where the U.S. naval base Guantanamo Bay is originated from. And after the U.S. occupation and for the first decades of the 20th century, U.S. businesses came to dominate Cuba, and Havana, as we'll see, was turned into a tourist destination for Americans during the early 20th century. And most of the Platt Amendment would be repealed in 1934. This was part of President Franklin Roosevelt's Good Neighbor policy, which we'll discuss after the midterm. But nonetheless, the Platt Amendment represents a clear case of the United States limiting Cuba's independence. And in the long run, these policies would create resentment, particularly in Cuba, and it would stir nationalism. And as we'll see after the midterm, U.S. dominance in Cuba would lead in many ways to the Cuban Revolution of 1959 and the rise of Fidel Castro, because they cited this history of 1898 and the Platt Amendment as a reason to oppose U.S. influence on the island. But we'll discuss all that after the midterm exam.